The third section is the theory of island biogeography. I mentioned Dr. E.O. Wilson earlier, the most influential scientist ever born in the state of Alabama. He grew up down in the Mobile area, and as a very young child loved being outside, so much so that he hooked himself in the eye as a young child, and instead of immediately going for medical attention, he didn't want to waste the time that he had outside and stayed where he was at, and the damage to that eye kind of pretty much ruled out baseball, other type activities. He found other things to really get into, and as a child he really got into bugs and was the first person to identify an invasive species in North America, which was the South American fire ants. They had hitched a ride, more than likely, on some cargo that had been brought into Mobile, and he identified them, and that was his first claim to fame. And he has gone on to write like the definitive book on ants, has done lots of great work in the field of biodiversity, and one is adding this entire topic to the body of knowledge. He and another fellow, McCarthy, back in '67, came up with the theory, and then Wilson went out with one of his students into the Florida Keys and proceeded to demonstrate it. And the way they did it was they basically took a couple of small islands in the Keys and just killed everything there, and then monitored to see if things came back in the way that they theorized that they would in first populating an island. And they were able to show that. So the factors that are determining this equilibrium that's going to happen, the equilibrium is going to see those points where the graphs are overlapping. And your species diversity. So the number of species on the island are, on the X, and your rates of immigration or extinction are on the Y. And where do you find the interruption? Well, you see these small island scales and the large island scales. Notice on the island size species area curve, you have greater size, greater habitat, greater niches, greater diversity. And then the next graph is the effect of distance from the mainland. Closer means greater immigration to replace species. So this was what they were looking at trying to show. Island biogeography is the study of the ecological relationships and distributions of organisms on islands, and of these organisms' community structures. Islands have been colonized in the past by new species arriving from somewhere else. So the founder effect. If a few individuals from a mainland population colonize an island, the genotypes on the island will represent only a subset of those on the mainland population. Same as the bottleneck effect. Some genotypes will not be present in the new population on the island. And it can show you here with the little mice. On the mainland, you had only a few that immigrated to the island, and then their gene pool is what's going to be populating from there. And if they stay apart long enough, this is another example of speciation. If they were to stay apart long enough, you may end up with them becoming so genetically different that they might not even be able to mate anymore. They may be so different that they become their own species. So here's another representation of their theory of island biogeography. As you can see, the larger island, increasing number of species. And also, if you're farther from the mainland, less biodiversity. So large and small island is a relationship, and then also near and far island is a relationship, showing you that the smaller island, smaller biodiversity, and the farther away island, less biodiversity than a near island of similar size. Many island species have evolved to be specialists versus generalists because of the limited resources. This is also why being an island species means you're typically more at risk of extinction. Your food and your territory are going to be more limited than on mainlands or larger islands. The long-term survival of specialists may be jeopardized if and when invasive species, which are typically going to be generalists, are introduced and they outcompete the specialists. If you've watched the cane toads, which we intentionally introduced because we wanted them to control pests on crops, and the pests were eating at a high level on the plant, and we put a critter in that doesn't climb or jump and thought it would take care of the problem. No, it ended up eating everything else, and including the native species of amphibians. One of the big problems that island birds are having right now is there are brown snakes that, of course, have been transported, either intentionally or accidentally by us or some other way, but they end up on an island they've not been before, and they just climb the trees and eat the birds' eggs, and the birds don't know any better because they've never had to compete against that before. So reviewing again ecological niches, the habitat versus niche. Again, habitat is where you live. That's your home. Your address. Your niche is your job. What do you do? How do you relate to the other individuals? Every species has a range of tolerance. It has limits to its abiotic conditions that it can tolerate, whether it be water temperature, oxygen content, it be amount of food, it be amount of area, it be whatever it might be. Your fundamental niche is your ideal. What you would really need for everything to be just, like it needs to be. Your realized niche is your actual, which can be limited by, as we've talked earlier, several different things, whether it be competition, whether it be disruption, whether it be niche overlap, whatever it might be. But your actual, what you're actually able to take advantage of, that's your realized niche. As we discuss a species niche, we need to know what types of categories of species we actually have. If a species is where it's expected to be found, it's where it's been throughout a regular time. It's native, it's endemic, it's indigenous. It's supposed to be there. If it's not, it's something that's somewhere where it's not normally found. If it's just in another place, we could call it non-native, or we could call it non-endemic. We could call it non-indigenous. We could call it just alien. But if it's any of those things and it's causing a problem, then we refer to it as an invasive or a nuisance species. So invasive and nuisance can be used interchangeably. Non-native, non-endemic, non-indigenous are all pretty much interchangeable, meaning that it's just not where it's supposed to be. The same goes for alien and exotic. Doesn't mean it's causing a problem. It just means that it's not where it's supposed to be. It's that invasive or nuisance is where you get the negative connotation. It's not only where it's not supposed to be, it's causing a problem. We have lots of examples in Alabama, and on our terrestrial side we have kudzu, which we intentionally brought over because we thought that it would be great for construction projects and controlling erosion, and it just grew everywhere. And we even went further then, and we decided, hey, let's bring in the kudzu bug to eat up the kudzu. And once it got here to the United States, it decided, wow, look at all this other stuff to eat, and it stopped eating kudzu and went to eating other things. We also have lots of other names for our species. An indicator species is a species that we use its success or failure, it's how it's doing to indicate how even larger scope is doing, whether it be a stream, whether it be an entire ecosystem. This is the smoke alarm species. This is the canary in the coal mine species. If you're unfamiliar with the old canary in the coal mine story, as the coal miners went into the mines, they had to worry about gas, and the gas was not something that we could easily smell or distinguish, but it could build up. It could not only cause breathing issues, but it could explode, so it could be very dangerous. So the way they took care of this is they carried a canary in a cage. And if you're unfamiliar with canaries, they are extremely let's just say they sing all the time. They're constantly making noise. But their metabolism is so much faster than ours, and they're going to be affected by things at much sooner times, body mass than we are. So they would take the canary down in them with them into the mines, and the canary is just going to sing all the time, If the gas built up, though, it was going to take out the canary way before it was going to take out a man. So they all knew that if canary stopped singing, it was time to get out of the mine. We use species now to do this. Water quality, we can look at certain things. We can look at the amphibian there. You see the frog. Because remember, their skin is basically like something like one cell thick almost. That's why they're able to breathe through and absorb so many things through their skin. So if there's contamination around, they're going to be one of the first things to be exposed to that. Same principle on ozone. If there's too much ozone coming through, almost any contaminant is going to affect them before it does a lot of other organisms. So if we've got healthy frogs and everything's, seems okay, and all of a sudden the frogs are gone, either you've had some new predator move in or you've got a contamination issue. Back to the water quality, we talked about how we can determine the health of a stream or whatever it might be just by identifying the macroinvertebrates and comparing and saying, okay, did we get a lot of category 1 this time? What did we get last time? And seeing how that's going up or down or if it's remaining stable. And then going further with additional lab testing if you've seen just from the bugs that there's something going on. A keystone species is just like in engineering. If you've ever seen an archway, that center stone typically is a trapezoid, that they stack everything else to it. And then the force upon one another and the friction holds the whole thing up. But if you yank that keystone out, the whole thing collapses. That's meaning that you have a species that is so important to an ecosystem that without it, the whole ecosystem can collapse. One of the best textbook examples is that of the California sea otter. I'll tell you about that in a slide or two. And then a foundational species. Foundational species is just like your house. You start off building your house by building the foundation. What's an example of a foundation species? Well, elephants. Elephants are the road builders in areas of the world where they clear the path so that other critters are able to follow through it. It may even be all the way down to the elephant dung, which have the elephant dung beetle, and they have the entire ecosystem going on in their dung. The one at the bottom here shows lake trout larvae, the abnormal swelling in the abdomen when it was exposed to concentrations of PCBs. PCBs, again, being what Lake Logan Martin has in Alabama. Other places with it as well, but that's one that's very well known because of the chemical plant that was allowing it to run off, and it has a half-life of roughly 500 years, so it will be there for quite some time to come. The other picture over there is a large snake. The Everglades have been significantly altered due to the invasive species, the pythons in particular, but boas as well, and I think even finding anacondas there now. But supposedly there was a large warehouse for like exotic pet trade that was damaged during one of the hurricanes, released several of them, and they have flat taken to the Everglades just like home, and they're reproducing faster than we can take them out. And you may think, well, this has got to be an odd case here where you have a snake trying to eat an alligator that big. That didn't work out very well. Typically, it's the big snakes taking out the eggs and the babies of other species. Is why our birds and mammals and alligators and other things have disappeared at such a huge rate in the Everglades. The fourth section is on ecological tolerance. This refers to the range of conditions such as temperature, salinity, flow rate, sunlight, those things that an organism can endure before injury or death is going to result. So you can see the bell curve here showing that the ideal is going to be in the center. This is where survival, growth, and reproduction are all happening at the optimum rates. And as you go away from that, out towards the tails of the curve, you get into the more and more difficult ability to survive. This one is showing temperature on the X and performance on the Y, meaning that as you move away from that ideal temperature, it gets more and more difficult for whatever it is we're representing here to survive. If you've ever had a fish tank at home, you know good and well that you don't go to the store and buy fish and bring them home and just dump them right into the tank. They cannot survive that temperature change very well. without going into shock. So you put the entire container of water that they're in the tank until it equalizes, and then release them. So that you're trying to get them into their ability to survive that and do their best at that temperature range. Ecological tolerance can apply to individuals, or it can apply to an entire species. When we talk about tolerance, we have to talk about the limiting factors. So, do the physical or chemical factors fall within the range tolerated by the species that we're looking at? So, what are some limiting factors? It can be light. Are you getting enough light to conduct photosynthesis? Has your water become too cloudy? Has there been too much soil running into it? Or is there something else causing it to be too cloudy that you can't conduct photosynthesis at the level you're living at? Is the temperature in the range that you're able to survive? Remember, we change our environment. We change our temperature. So we live pretty much everywhere, but we have the ability to create a building and turn on heat and wear thicker clothing, whereas the majority of organisms on the planet do not follow that path. They have to live in areas where they naturally can just exist and survive in that temperature range. Dissolved oxygen. Without dissolved oxygen, the fish are going to not be able to survive, and whatever the aquatic organisms we're talking about, because that necessary amount of oxygen for conducting cellular respiration. The nutrients. Are there enough nutrients for you to be able to do the things you need to do? Are there predators that are going to keep your numbers down? Are there enough prey for you to eat, wherever you fall in the trophic level, whatever critter we're talking about? So again, as you can see, when you get out to the tails, you're getting into the very low survival rate. And when you start to move in and further and further and further until you get to the center, the high range or highest part rather, of the bell curve, you see that's where the majority of things are going to be thriving. The biodiversity of ecosystems can be affected by natural disruptions. We throw them into several different scales. If we say periodic, well, that's repeating at fairly regular intervals. That would be like the tide coming in or out. When we get into random, that's occurring very sporadically and would be in the line of, say, a volcanic eruption. Episodic means it's going to be repeating, but the intervals are not going to be regular like the tides. This would be the ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the rising and lowering of sea level and temperature of the Pacific Ocean, and the effect that it has on anywhere from Australia all the way to the southern United States as far as climate. Hurricanes would also probably fall into the episodic category as well. So as you look at the two charts showing the end of the last glacial age all the way up through going through times that you'll recognize in our history, and the temperature. And you see on the bottom chart the sea level record, and then the CO2 levels from ice cores. Natural disruptions have consequences that may, for a given occurrence, be as great as or greater than a lot of our man-made disruptions. When Mount St. Helens went off in the United States, the big one that went off in 79, I think it was, only took 17 days for the material release to circumnavigate the globe. And 91, when Pinatubo went off in the Philippines, put enough stuff in the air to change their average temperature by 3 degrees. These are big changes in short periods of time. That's why the theories on the KT event of extinctions 65 million years ago was the combination of lots of volcanic activity and asteroids slamming into the planet. So continuing on talking about disruptions, our Earth system processes operate on a range of scales. Again, in terms of time, they can be periodic, episodic, or random. Our climate has changed over geological time for many reasons. Sea levels varied significantly as a result of changes in the amount of glacial ice on Earth over that geological time. Major environmental change or upheaval commonly results in large swaths of habitat changes, and wildlife engages in both short and long-term migration for a variety of reasons, including natural disruptions. Section 6 is on adaptations, and I've included another video here on 5 fingers of evolution. Again, I'll put those in the notes as well and on the pacing guide so that you'll have access to those in multiple places. But this would be a good time to visit that short video. Quick summary of evolution by natural selection. There are the 5 basic parts of the theory. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. The example that almost every textbook likes to throw in is the cod fish. That if every cod egg made it to adulthood, that we would all, no matter where you're at right now in class, wherever listening to these notes, we would all be about neck deep in cod fish if they all survive to adulthood. Well, they don't, and the adults, are taken out in large numbers from overfishing on top of that. Not all offspring can survive, since there exists a struggle for survival. Sea turtles lay a large clutch of eggs, and very, very few of those are going to make it to adulthood to lay eggs themselves. Individuals vary in traits. We're not all exactly the same, even though we may be of the same species. Some traits are positively selected for. These are said to be advantageous, and those individuals then have more offspring because they just so happen to be the ones that were most suited to whatever the change might be, the disruption. And over time, through generations, the gene for that advantageous trait increases in frequency. It's not that they just decided to. It's not like the bacteria down here decided to go to the gym and work out so that they were the strongest ones, so that they were the ones, the biggest and baddest on the block. That's not what the survival of the fittest means. The survival of the fittest means which one is most suited to put more genes into the next generation. The ones that are going to survive at a greater rate because of some mutation, some difference that made them better suited to whatever the disruption might have been. This is where a lot of people go wrong with this. They think, it's got to be the biggest, baddest guy on the block. It's got to be, no, not necessarily. It's, what is that thing that's different that your particular genes are better suited for, that allows you to be around to reproduce so that your offspring are the ones that are happening with more frequency. The example here, it shows a bunch of bacteria, including a resistant variety. In other words, it was, not a whole lot. You're trying to treat them with some antibiotic, and as you do, you're going to kill off the majority of them. But that resistant one is still around. And eventually, even though you've used whatever antibiotic you've used before, you're not killing anything. This is the same thing that goes with the pesticide treadmill, where you build up, or we cause the resistance in the insect world to show up because we use some pesticide over and over again until eventually the only ones that are left are the ones that the pesticide wouldn't kill. So they're the ones reproducing until eventually we can spray all we want and we don't kill anything. So just how does a trait change? As you can see here, there are 3 different categories. The directional selection is the selection against one extreme. So you have the for and the against. Being the extreme trait, here it being the length of the tail on the little gecko, it looks like. So long wiggly tails look like a snake and scare predators. The longer the tail, the more it looks like a snake. So it's advantageous to have that longer tail. So over time, more of the ones with longer tails would be surviving, and the shorter tail would start to disappear. Stabilizing selection, meaning that extremes are not good. So you have the short tail and the really long tail, neither one work as well as the medium length tail. So you have a meeting in the middle kind of deal here. So the ones with the medium-sized tails are going to survive at a better rate than the ones with the extremes. So the for would be the moderate trait. Against would be either extreme. And then you have disruptive selection, whereas the extremes would be the preferred versus the moderate. So here you see that short tails help keep predators from catching you when you're on the ground, so you could get that food. But then long tails are also very good for balancing the trees, so you're not falling out of the trees as much. So medium tails don't really have any benefit of any kind, so that's the one that doesn't end up being around as much after a while. So again, these are showing examples of how you would actually show a population over time, how they're moving towards a particular trait, how that trait would change over time. Again, the first one was the one extreme or the other. That extreme in particular was the longer. And the middle is the one basically in the middle. It's the stabilizing. It's, the extremes weren't a good thing. The middle was. And then the right one, the disruptive, that's the one where the extremes each way are the better scenario. And the ones who have that trait are the ones who are around more to put their genes into the next generation. So eventually you have more of that thing. Humans influence evolution by artificial selection. We find particular traits we want and continually breed and breed and breed just for that. We did not have big, huge ears of corn just in nature for us to discover and start eating them. We bred for that. Corn originally started off, a grass, and we just continually bred and bred and bred until we got the size we're after. It's just like when you watch the pumpkin chunking contest and you see these massive pumpkins. It's where they've continually kept the seeds from the largest one and continually bred for that thing. It's the rose competitions where they're always breeding to get particular colors. Cows. We have bred and bred for different breeds of livestock to be able to get the ones that produce the best milk or the ones we think have the best food or best beef or the best, whatever it might be, we breed for. Dogs, in just a very short period of time as far as what goes in history, we have bred from certain species like wolves to get all this variety of pets that we have. So when we determine the individuals that are going to breed, we choose, because we're doing it based off of wanting particular outcomes. That's artificial selection. We can have more efficient crops. We can have more useful livestock. We can have aesthetically pleasing species. The cons, well, the overuse of the herbicide Roundup has led to herbicide-resistant weeds. The overuse of antibiotics has led to drug-resistant bacteria. MRSA being an example. So we've even moved on now to genetic engineering. How does genetic engineering work? We take a single gene, we isolate it, modify it. Many copies of the gene are then inserted into plant cells and induced to grow. And the seeds from those mature plants are then studied and used for successful transformation. One example here is corn, where we've taken corn and we have genetically modified it so that it is not affected by Roundup, so that the companies that are growing this corn can plant the whole field, spray it with Roundup, and nothing competes. So you don't have to worry about weeding or plowing in between the rows or anything else, because the only thing that's going to grow is going to be the corn. But it's this overuse of Roundup that's led to weeds now that are not affected by it. Lots of problems and concerns with genetic engineering, so that's something we can go into more in another area. Organisms adapt to their environment over time, both in short and long-term scales, via incremental changes at the genetic level. Now, how pesticide resistance develops, we have, again, a pesticide we're spraying. We spray the first time, and we may or may not get all the bugs, and we kill off some. But the problem is in that population, there may have existed some of that species that just genetically were a little different. They had some mutated genes, just means a change in their genes that was different than others in their population. And they weren't affected by the pesticide. So you can come back and spray in subsequent times, subsequent sprayings, and do a very thorough coverage and kill off everything that you could kill off. And the only ones left are the ones that were bothered from it, even in the first place. They were, genetically different enough that they weren't affected by it. Well, they're going to keep reproducing until eventually the only ones reproducing are the ones that your pesticide doesn't kill. Until eventually all you have are the ones that are resistant and your pesticide does no good. This is why chemical companies are always having to study and adjust formulas, and we end up with some things we just can't kill anymore. When disruptions happen, a species only has three real options. If their environment has changed beyond their optimum survivability, they have moved out of their area of tolerance, then they can only do one of three things. They can move to another area that has their tolerance level, their tolerance range. They can, over time, become genetically different. They can change their behaviors. Or if they are unable to do any of those things, then that's where extinctions come into play. As you see from the graphs over here, the red pine current distribution, the red pine predicted distribution in 2100, the loblolly pine current distribution, and the loblolly pine predicted distribution in 2100. As you can see, we have planted a tremendous amount of the south in loblolly because that's one that grows pretty quickly and we harvest it. Whereas if you go back in time, that's not where it originally was. But you see the abundance. Environmental changes can be either sudden or gradual. May threaten species survival, again requiring individuals to alter behaviors, move, or perish. Section 7 is the last section of biodiversity. We will discuss primary and secondary succession, and that will finish up this set of notes. I will provide, this is just the PowerPoint, I will provide a much more in-depth set of notes and also a section of PowerPoints on Alabama's biodiversity. Ecological succession, this is community transitions. This is just how things change over time. What replaces what? You may start out with bare rock, and the way we'd end up with bare rock is a glacier has retreated or a volcano has erupted and just pushed to the surface of the ocean. And that bare rock is going to be colonized by what's said to be pioneer species. So these are going to be the first ones to move in, just like the pioneers were the first ones to move across the west. Pioneer species are the ones that are the first ones to move in. Typically going to be things like algae, lichens, and mosses. Lichens being one that is that colorful, flaky-looking stuff that you've seen growing on a log or a rock or a side of a tree. Looks like you could just peel it right off. It's going to grow. It's going to absorb some nutrients from the rock, which means it's pulling little pieces apart. It's going to die and decompose as wind and water are going to break more pieces off. If you're in a place where it can freeze, as water gets into fissures and freezes, it's going to expand and cause things to crack even more. If you've got any elevation change, as things fall downhill because of gravity and crash into other smaller pieces, in other words, you've got little particles of rock and some organic and some water, and you eventually get soil starting to be formed. So these things are going to excrete acids, which help break down the rock into soil. Mid-successional plants are then going to move in as they are easily dispersed. These are going to be your grasses and wildflowers. Then the ecosystem gradually matures, depending upon temperature and rainfall, until eventually you end up with a few years down the road, some shrubs, then aspen, cherry, and young pine trees, and eventually, way down the road, the beech and maples. So the key thing between primary and secondary succession, that primary succession we just talked about takes place where there was no ecosystem there before. It starts off as bare rock. There wasn't anything there previously. Secondary succession is when you've had some disturbance of something that did exist. You had a forest, it got chopped down. You had a farm that was forest at one time. It was a farm for a while. Now it's been ignored, and the field is turning back into whatever it's going to become. So secondary is you've had something, you've had a fire come through, you've had a storm, you've had some disruption, something has happened, and now you have another ecosystem starting to form. So this is secondary succession. This is more common, occurs in areas that have experienced a disturbance but not lost all their soil, being hurricanes, floods, forest fires, abandoned farms. The mid-successional plants are going to move in as they're easily dispersed. So again, you start off with some annuals. That's the stuff that's just going to grow once, die off, and you've got to replant it again or something. Some more seeds have got to blow in kind of thing. And that's going to be in the first, very short period of time, first, years kind of thing. And, a little bit down the road, you're going to end up with the perennials, the weeds and some grasses starting to pop up. And eventually you'll end up with the woody stuff, the shrubs, and then the younger pine trees, until eventually, which may be 100 years or more out, you end up with that mature old hickory forest in this one. So this says the ecosystem gradually matures depending on temperature and rainfall until eventually you end up with that mixed hardwood forest at the end. Aquatic succession, you can end up with intertidal systems. So disturbances can cause exposure to the air, the turnover of rocks, other things from just the tides. The diatoms, red and green algae, are going to be the first things to colonize, eventually followed by barnacles, which are going to attach themselves to things and live there. In lakes, glaciers can carve out a lake. In other words, as a glacier is retreating, it can leave depressions in the ground as it melts, fills it with water. Eventually be colonized by aquatic plants. The plants dying, decomposing, erosion as things wash into are eventually going to fill the lake with sediment. It's going to die over time, but it could take thousands of years for this to happen. Eventually it will become a terrestrial ecosystem. But this is not going to be just a day or two thing. Now, if we speed the process up through eutrophication, then it can happen much more quickly. So the rates of succession and disturbance can be affected by many things. Here we're talking about facilitation. In other words, helping succession along. Legumes can add nitrogen to soil. If you've ever noticed fields around where you live being planted in different things, meaning that it may have been a sod farm for years and all of a sudden it's planted in something else, and then a few years later it goes back to the sod. What they're doing is rotating through crops because some things will add nutrients to the soil, other things are robbing it of nutrients. Inhibition, an example of one that's going to inhibit would be red tide. Red tide is not only going to have the same effects as eutrophication, meaning that there's going to be a huge outbreak of this algae and them dying and being decomposed is going to rob the water of oxygen. This stuff also produces toxic chemicals that can be bad for not only the aquatic organisms but also terrestrial or birds as well. And then there's the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, meaning that the frequent moderate disturbances can actually increase species diversity. By giving just enough of a stressor to cause response, you can end up with, over time, an increase in species diversity. Continue on with the thought of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, how this allows for greater ecosystem complexity, which can lead to greater species diversity. As you can see, this community development, how it's going to continue through succession. As you see the circle, as you're trying to reach that climax community, as you have some disturbance, as it kind of shortens the loop there, you're, again, providing those stressors that you end up with, those who are going to be better suited to that disturbance. And then you have, the differences starting to show up. And then you have another disturbance, and you have another disturbance. That's happening, not at, very quickly, but at that intermediate time length. You can end up with that speciation happening because of those disturbances. Succession does change, is a change in species composition. It's your succession. Some things are going to be replacing other things. It's a perpetual process. This is going on continually. And we can classify it as to early or late succession. In an early succession is referred to as an immature succession. You have several things are going to be considered, low. Your complexity of your ecosystem, the diversity of your species, the number of your niches, your trophic structure are going to be low in those early succession stages. Your productivity is going to be very high, though. These things are starting to really take off and really starting to try and compete. Once you've reached that climax community, you're considered to be a mature community. This is late succession. Your complexity is going to be very high in your ecosystem. Your diversity is typically going to be much higher. Your number of niches is going to be much higher. Your trophic structure, those energy levels, is going to be much higher. But your productivity is not going to be as great because you've got these things established. They're not growing as volumetrically as they were when things first got rolling. This is just summarizing again, primary versus secondary. Primary, there was no soil present. Soil's got to be created. So that's what's going on in primary. Secondary, it's there. It may have gotten messed up. May have been a storm, may have been something else, but it's still some there and having to start over. Just to add a little bit of area specific to us, when you get into that shrubs section of this succession, in our area right after that you would start to see pine and sweet gum. That's two of the things you start to see pop up very commonly in our area as some of the first things to grow. But eventually the oak trees are going to grow up tall enough to choke out a lot of those pines in some areas. A lot of what you see in our state now is considered tree plantations, where we have basically stripped off the native diversity and we've replanted with the monoculture of the harvestable loblolly pine. So revisiting keystone species. Keystone species in ecosystem is a species whose activities have a particularly significant role in determining community structure. We also talked about that cascade effect from predators. You see the graph at the top right of what happens to diversity when the keystone predator is present versus not present. You can see how things went significantly different. Beavers are one of the things that affect, or I guess you manipulate their environment after us, more so than just about any other critter. But I really want to talk about the California sea otter you see there at the bottom. Go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we thought we had pretty much wiped the California sea otters out. Very few of them left. Well, it turns out that they have the skill set to be able to eat urchins. And when their population dwindled, the sea otters, because of fur, because again they're living in a colder ocean than we're used to having here. The Gulf is much warmer than the Pacific along California's coast. So they have that very dense, thick fur, meaning that we like to use them for making stuff out of, so we hunted them. There was no laws that said you couldn't. We pretty much wiped them out. While their numbers were so decimated, the sea urchin population went nuts, and they will eat all the time. So they ate up the kelp. Kelp's those long, green, ribbony-looking things. If you've ever seen any images in the ocean where they've shown kelp, it makes a forest basically in the ocean. The kelp provides habitat for lots of critters, and the urchins will eat it up, meaning that if the kelp goes away, then the home for all those other species goes away. And the only reason the urchin population went up is because we decimated the California sea otters. It turns out we didn't kill them all off, and they found like a small family of them still surviving in some cove, and we put them under protection, and we got their numbers to recover. However, they've plateaued recently, and there's studies going on right now that they think that there's just not enough of them for their population to continue to thrive and really progress because of either that bottleneck we forced them through or continued pollution and other issues as well, but that's being looked into. So that's why they're considered to be a keystone species. Without them, the whole thing can collapse. But once we restored them and they got their numbers back up, they went back to eating urchins, and kelp grew back, and stuff came back that was living there. So a species that plays a role in its community that is far more important than its relative abundance might suggest. They typically exist in low numbers. Again, you can't have some of these things in greater numbers than the stuff that they're living off of. They may be predators. They may be the source of food. They may be in a mutualistic relationship, meaning that not only do they benefit, but that others may benefit from them, vice versa. Or they're provider of some other essential service, whatever it might be that we're talking about. As you see, the California sea otters and the starfish up there at the top are both examples of predators that keep some other things that cause problems at bay. The beaver may not be a top predator, but they are definitely creating and being the keystone species of that ecosystem. They go away, the pond disappears as well because they were the ones keeping the water there. So just another example or two of indicator species. We talked about the amphibians and the frogs. Their indicator species can be plants. Here you see the lichens. Different amounts of lichens can tell us how much sulfur dioxide is in the air. So if you're getting acid rain from sulfur, lichens will be one of the first places we can tell that. Black spot fungus. If there's no black spot fungus on a rose, then there's lots of sulfur dioxide in the air. So just by its presence or abundance or scarcity or chemical composition, these species can demonstrate that some distinctive aspect of the character quality of an ecosystem is present. The smoke alarms, the canary in the coal mine again. Pioneer species, again, the first things to move in to an unoccupied habitat. Over time, they can adapt to particular conditions, which may result in the origin of new species. That's speciation. They've just become different enough by being separated by physical or some other means that they are, over time, can become so different that they can no longer interbreed and are now considered to be their own species. Again, Darwin's finches here. There you have the ones that have lived off of certain food sources in different areas for so long that they have genetically become so different that they are their own separate species now. And the last thought on succession, in a disturbed ecosystem, it will affect the total biomass. It will affect the species richness and the net productivity over time. Disturbed ecosystems are going to be affected by this in a way that it's going to be measurable. Here you see the field that at one time was, you see the trees in the background, so this was probably forest. It has been stripped off completely and has been planted in a monoculture. Definitely has affected what that ecosystem is able of doing. And this happens whether it be from man-made causes or whether it happens naturally. Again, there will be much more provided in the notes section as well, so make sure you take a look at that. This has been Biodiversity.